In this video, we are looking at efficiency and equity in land use planning as part of Chapter 8 in your textbook. Property rights are important because they determine what can and cannot be done with property. We examine 4 types of property. State property. Individuals may not be allowed to use or even exploit the resource, but only according to rules imposed by the state. That is, individuals can use it, but not necessarily, and they have to follow the rules imposed by the state. Private property. Private property owners have the right to utilize and benefit from the exploitation, conservation, or sale of the resource if there are no negative externalities. That's a key point here. Note that private property cannot exist without state sanction and protection. A third type of property ownership is common property, where a group of owners manages the resource, excluding those who are not members of the group. Members have specific rights and duties. And finally, no property rights, or what we refer to as open access, res nullius. When there is no assigned property right, open or free access is the result. Under open access, each potential user of the resource has complete autonomy to utilize the resource, since none has the legal right to keep another potential user out. Open access frequently leads to overexploitation, and in the case of resources that could potentially go extinct, they often do. Now, when it comes to open access, we look at economic overexploitation, the problem of extinction or depletion. There are 2 costs to consider. One is the private extraction costs, and the second is what is referred to as the user cost. So if you harvest a unit of resource today, this means that this unit and the future growth from this unit, so its offspring in the case of a biological asset such as the fishery, is not available for future consumption. The future value of uncaught fish and unharvested trees depends on many different factors, including discount rates, future markets for the resource, technological developments, reproductive features, and so on. But a sole farm, private owner, aiming to maximize profits, will maximize the discounted value of this rent and treat the resource as an asset. So they may not catch the next fish, but allow that fish to reproduce and create more fish that they catch later. With open access, the user cost is simply ignored, and that is the problem. Efficiency and externality. There are 3 types of externalities. There's a technological externality that is also Pareto relevant. For example, pollution abatement could improve a firm's efficiency. That is, by implementing certain things that reduce the amount of pollution. It turns out that some factories, some manufacturing places will actually enhance their own efficiency. A Pareto relevant externality occurs when a policy is considered to be Pareto efficient. And it's Pareto efficient if it leads to an improvement in the welfare of at least one person, but there's no reduction in the welfare of any other person. And you could substitute here for person an economic entity like a manufacturing outfit or something like that. Then there's the public goods externality. Once a good or service is provided, everyone benefits. The marginal cost of adding another user is essentially 0. And if you remember that efficient pricing says that the price should equal the marginal cost, well, the price should be 0. So once we build a highway, the cost of another person driving on that road is essentially 0 up to the point of congestion. So open space, for example, is an example of a public good. The current visual or the use amenity value, plus we maintain the future ability to produce agricultural crops. Those are the 2 benefits from open space. The current visual recreational use or whatever amenity value, plus the ability in the future to still use that property to grow crops, let's say, as opposed to having a parking lot or a building on that property. And finally, the third one is a technical externality. This refers to the reduction in public service costs when, for example, density is increased. So for example, when we put in a rapid transit terminal somewhere, or pardon me, a station, and we increase the density around it, makes that rapid transit resource more valuable. The planning authority also, if it encompasses more of the potential externalities, that is a larger jurisdiction, then it is more efficient and you have a technical externality being addressed there. Land use in the state. The state is unavoidable in terms of land use. Land use planning and control are increasingly employed by governments to direct land development in so-called socially desirable ways. The Land and Development Commission in Oregon, which came into being in the 1970s, controls all decisions regarding land use, even decisions about removing large trees from your property. Land use control in British Columbia is exercised, for example, through the Agricultural Land Reserve, where we preserve agricultural lands by freezing development. And we'll talk about that in the next video. Social control over private land use is expanding. What enables the state to exercise control over land that is considered private property? That is, are property rights inviolable? British common law has never given anyone exclusive right to acquire, use, and dispose of property. Feudal England, for example, no person except the king, later the state, owned the absolute right to property. In many countries, developing countries, in Africa, for example, Ethiopia, in Peru, in South America, the state owns the land, all the land. In biblical Israel, all the land was held as a trust from God. Property could only be leased to others, returning to the original owners or stewards in the 50th year, the year of Jubilee. In Israel, the poor had a right to some of the produce of the land. They had a right to so-called glean the fields behind the harvesters, so pick up anything that the harvesters left behind. The harvesters were not allowed to pick that up. Early American settlements followed this biblical transition in their own land use planning, and it was a way for the poor to be fed. Everything changed with the age of individualism. Property rights became inviolable. From the 1770s to the mid-1960s, U.S. courts considered property rights to be absolute, but since the mid-1960s, this attitude has changed, primarily because it's come in conflict with human rights. Externalities in the acquisition, use, and disposition of property are major reasons for social control over the use of private property. The social costs and benefits of land use are not the same as are the private costs and benefits. Social limitations upon the private rights of ownership. We talk about eminent domain, which permits government to take property, private property, for public use, but only if just compensation is provided. And that becomes an issue as to what just compensation is, and that will be discussed also in the next video. Eminent domain applies not only to land, but to any takings from individuals. For example, taxes to pay for public welfare programs. We have to look at what the benefits are to the persons being taxed, and in this case, the benefits to people who are being taxed are essentially perhaps feel good that they're helping poor people, or that they are being protected against the potential of poor people to rob them. Takings is another word for this eminent domain. Ingenious arguments for taking things from individuals are a result of a takings clause that protects individuals or is designed to protect people. An example of ingenious arguments might be the case of the taking that was of private land in Richmond, BC by courts for Cowichan Indigenous peoples back in 2025 in in the summer of 2025. Political philosophers question whether or not many government actions are justified under the takings clause in the U.S. Constitution, for example. Are these takings constitutional? Many public institutions now regulate and exercise control over the use of land either by direct regulation or through incentives such as taxes and subsidies, or through some combination of these. However, simply demonstrating inefficiency in land utilization resulting from reliance on a market mechanism is insufficient justification for planning. It's insufficient justification for government intervention. Land use planning must lead to efficient land use by eliminating or at least reducing Pareto-relevant externalities. So what are the costs of land use planning? Well, there's the cost of organizing, implementing, and administrating land use controls, and second, the social costs associated with restricting land use. The benefits of land use plannings are then the environmental and ecological service benefits, the noise reduction, flood prevention, waste absorption of nature, of the natural environment. There are recreational benefits. There's benefits from population control through density requirements or lack of density requirements. Preservation of agricultural land is often cited as a benefit. Performance standards are perhaps a better alternative than zoning because they're more flexible and they provide an incentive to reduce the externality, to reduce noise, to reduce heavy traffic in a particular area, or to prevent heavy trucks from driving down the street where there's a school zone, say. They directly focus on objectionable behavior, but the problem is monitoring and especially enforcement of performance standards may be difficult, if not impossible. So what are the potential criteria for evaluating alternative land use controls? Well, first, the effectiveness in achieving planned objectives, the effects on the distribution of costs and benefits. That is probably to the state or overseeing agency. There are organizational and administrative costs. Political and legal acceptability is important. Effects on the provision of other public services and their financing is important. And whether controls are direct or indirect. Information gathering costs under indirect controls tend to be higher for individuals than under direct controls. So what about political acceptability? Public intervention in the private land use is justified when private use imposes costs or confers benefits upon others. That is your externality again. Public intervention takes place through instruments such as zoning, regulation, or permissible land uses, taxes, subsidies, etc., as already mentioned. The takings clause in the U.S. Constitution requires compensation be provided whenever government uses its eminent domain power to restrict land use. Canada does not have a takings clause in its constitution, but provincial laws prevent governments from expropriating property rights without compensation. And common law provides that compensation be paid to those that are affected. Zoning provides partial compensation for the loss of valuable property rights, and it may be necessary to make land use control politically acceptable and legal by, it would have to be done by the state somehow, and we'll look into that some more as we go along. There are problems of zoning because there are appeals and variances around the zoning, and there's the perception, whether based in fact or not, that the system or plan can be tampered with if one is sufficiently rich or well connected. Transferable or tradable development rights are one means of mitigating the adverse income distributional effects of zoning, as we discuss in the next video. So here's the land use planning model, or two models. One is a blueprint model where objectives and alternative programs and policies are decided upon. There's an analysis, a decision, a plan is made, the plan, and action is implemented. The alternative is where objectives and alternative programs and policies are stated. There's analysis, a referral perhaps to a political process as part of that analysis. A decision is made, an action is taken. There's a feedback back to the objectives and programs and policies to see if they have to be changed, and some of that is referred through the political process. And this is the informational model. Zoning is the oldest and most easily recognized form of planning. It's used as a means of separating activities of adjacent but dissimilar firms and households that imposed externalities upon each other. Zoning of certain areas of the ocean has led to a greater abundance of species, particularly those that are exploited outside the zoned area, but you can think of these ocean areas as being quite large. Zoning and land use planning have generally been separated in legislation and administration, so zoning and land use planning have been separated, which is unfortunate since they are not separate functions. So consider land use issues at the intensive margin, the urban-rural interface, and at the extensive margin, the development-nature interface. We're going to do that in the next video and only near the end. At the intensive margin, the rural-urban interface, instruments are command and control, zoning, an urban service boundary. That was used in Saskatoon, for example, where homes inside the boundary were able to get services that those outside the boundary could not get, although there was always the pressure, the lobbying to get a variance when you were outside that service boundary. The Agricultural Land Reserve in British Columbia is an example. Adverse consequences of zoning include the income redistributional issue and the incentives for rent seeking to get your property out of a particular zone. Say it's in agricultural land and you want to put it into, or you want to work to get it into either residential land zoning or commercial industrial. So zoning has within it the seeds of its own demise. Suppose unzoned land is now zoned, developed, and agriculture. So we've got this non-zoned land that is worth $500 a hectare, and if you could get it developed, it's going to be worth $2,000 a hectare, so you gain $1,500 per hectare. If it is zoned agriculture, in other words, a decision has now been made as to how that non-zoned land will be used, then if it goes into agriculture and it's worth $400 per hectare, then there's a loss of $100 per hectare. So zoning has within it the seeds of its own demise. So we have developed land now, as indicated here on the left, and its new value is $2,000. If you have 10 hectares, then of land, it's worth $20,000. If your land is in agriculture and it's worth $400 a hectare, then it's worth $4,000 if you have 10 hectares. So there's an incentive for taking this block of land and shifting it into the developed area. And in other words, lobbying somehow to move the land out of agricultural zoning into developed zoning. So the owner of the land can gain $16,000 by getting land rezoned from agriculture to commercial industrial, say. So there's a huge incentive for rent seeking. Economic efficiency. Zoning is just a blunt instrument, and performance standards are better, but as noted, monitoring of standards and enforcement could be a problem. Externality, the open space and the farmland. So the preservation of agricultural output because of uncertainty about future food supply has been one of the main reasons why BC has adopted an agricultural land reserve. The problem is that the agricultural land reserve is often used as a reason for having land taken out of residential or commercial area, or prevented from going into residential or commercial areas. But the real underlying reason is that people don't want that development. So let's look at that a little bit more. So we identify what is called option value, which is uncertainty about future supply, and quasi-option value, which is uncertainty about future demand. Now pay close attention, because these two are related, but they're different, because one focuses on supply, the option value, the quasi-option value on demand. So option value is the amount people are willing to pay to preserve farmland, or to pay to preserve grizzly bears, killer whales, or some other mega species. They're willing to pay over and above the current value to them to maintain the option of having the farmland available to them in the future, given its future supply is uncertain. So there's a risk that a parcel of farmland is going to be taken out of agriculture and zoned or somehow be used as for commercial, industrial, or residential development. If that happens, then it can no longer be used in agriculture, and that potential future agricultural production is lost. So the future supply of agricultural commodities from that land is uncertain. It assumes rather that the uncertainty about future supply occurs, but is caused by risk aversion on the part of demanders. So it's the uncertainty about future supply that is the situation, but it is caused by, or option value occurs because there's risk aversion on the part of demanders. In the case of farmland, if the future supply of agricultural output is uncertain, people will buy farmland and its price should go up. The opportunity cost of developing land will increase, and the price of agricultural land will be higher than warranted by its current productivity. And there is some evidence to indicate that the price of agricultural land is indeed higher than it is based on its current productivity, particularly land near cities or urban areas. So that we have an externality, open space and farmland preservation. So now we come to this quasi-option value, QOV. It's related to uncertainty about the benefits of preserving farmland, or the benefits of preserving bears and whales, but it assumes risk neutrality on the part of individuals. They're neutral about the risk. It's related to the uncertainty about demand. Do I really want this thing in the future? Do I really want agricultural land in the future? So quasi-option value. By delaying a decision, say about developing farmland, more information about the costs and benefits of farmland protection or the costs and benefits of development become available. By waiting, some of the uncertainty may be resolved. Remember, the uncertainty is not with, or the risk is not on the behavior of the demander, the consumer. Information always has value. This is referred to as quasi-option value, the benefit of remaining flexible. Based on quasi-option value, it pays to remain flexible, but not overly so. And in that regard, it's very similar to the safe minimum standard of conservation that we looked at, particularly with regards to Table 2.1 in Chapter 2. Quasi-option value does not come from better information becoming available, but from a revision of one's beliefs. It is beliefs that are important. Quasi-option value is the difference between the actual value when all uncertainty is resolved and the expected value, which depends upon the people who were involved. In practice, quasi-option value is small and unlikely to result in changes in the outcome of a cost-benefit analysis. So how do we protect farmland if private markets fail? Past public policies in most places have failed. They've encouraged urban sprawl into the countryside, which is caused by underpriced rural services and infrastructure, subsidized fuel, etc. It's also created urban brownfields, which are caused by the same factor as here. And it may even be caused by, and it is caused mainly by, rent controls. So empirical evidence from the US, where about 300,000 acres, so divide that by 2.47 to come up with hectares, per year are converted to urban use. Much land in the US, particularly in the West, is owned by the Bureau of Land Management, the BLM, and the US Forest Service, the USFS, plus various state agencies like state forestry agencies. So not surprisingly, much urban land was previously range or forest land. So we see that 37% of urbanization comes from forest land, 29% from pasture land and range, 28% from cropland. Sorry about that, isn't lined up properly, and other land 6%. The major reason why cropland and other agricultural land is converted to urban uses is its poor farm profitability. 74% of the reason is poor farm profitability. The second most important reason, of course, is high development value of the land. So if you've got land close to a city and development and it's growing, then it's the high development value of the land that results in its conversion to urban uses. Note that a lot of farmland was also converted to forest, recreation, wilderness, and other uses, and not just to urban development. So if we look at British Columbia's Agricultural Land Reserve, it was an NDP government policy in 1973. Farmland owners were not compensated. There was a famous case of near Kamloops to convert ranch land into golf course in the early 2000s that caused a furor over the Agricultural Land Reserve, and the report that was done on that indicated that farmland should be protected at all cost, which seemed an unreasonable thing to do at all cost. The decisions about Agricultural Land Reserve reside initially with the municipality in question, but it's the Agricultural Land Commission, and at times these are regional commissions. That makes the final decision, but the final arbitrator is the provincial cabinet. There's confusion between farmland and open space. I was trying to get at that a little earlier, but neighbors often lobby to keep land in agriculture when they all know it's incapable of producing crops. Rather, they simply want open space. So if we look at open space, it's a public good since there is non-exclusion. My viewing does not prevent your viewing. My walking of the dog in an open space usually doesn't affect your walking of a dog in the open space. Zoning protects open space, but benefits are not shared equally, although costs may be shared equally. So the benefits may accrue to those living nearer the open space, whereas people who are living across the city or elsewhere are also sharing in the costs. Suppose a hayfield can be developed into a shopping center and we wish to have open space. So the options for protecting the hayfield as open space are that the government buys the open space and pays for it using an ad valorem tax on nearby residents. Okay, then the costs are borne by those who benefit more. The government plus nearby residents can share the cost of the initial purposes. Who benefits and who benefits the most? The problem with policies to protect farmland are essentially this impermanence syndrome that we talked about a little earlier. Farm fields are too small and fragmented. There's no incentive to invest in agriculture. Tax breaks may be needed to keep the land in agriculture. Currently, the standard to maintain agricultural status of your land is pretty low. Every 2 years you have to be able to sell a certain amount of product, which is equivalent to perhaps selling a cow or 2 cows. And what happens is the neighbor may buy 2 cows from the person next door, and the person next door buys it back 2 years later. And that's sufficient to maintain agricultural status and a lower tax base. The problem is that there are often nuisance complaints from nearby residents, and right to farm legislation is needed to deflect complaints about noise and smell. But farmers near urban areas are subject to vandalism and trespass, and as a result of these factors, farms fields being too small and fragmented, farms themselves being fragmented, no incentive to invest, nuisance complaints, vandalism, trespass, all of these result in the value of land in agriculture being reduced. So what are some options? Well, we could purchase property rights. The state can purchase farmland around the urban core and lease it back to farmers. The state can purchase farmland and sell it in part or whole back to farmers, but minus certain development rights. The state buys development rights, so we can see that in the next video. And it buys those development rights, thereby injecting money into the agricultural economy. It does not lessen pressure on future farmland development, however. And it can be costly, as an experience in King County, Washington, or the Seattle area has found. Fourth, restrictive covenants that restrict what farmers can do on land can be employed. These restrict certain cropping practices. They're binding on future landowners, but they're used by the Canadian Wildlife Service, for example, in land use contracts in the Al-Aksum Wildlife Management Area at West Ham Island in Delta, British Columbia. Conservation easements can be used to restrict land use on a proportion of land. Example, conservation easements on infill land. There's an area in Saanich, British Columbia, where they built housing, but the back of the housing area was under a conservation easement so that people could not cut any of the Gary oaks that were on that land, regardless of the fact that they owned the land minus that conservation easement restriction. Conservation obligations that require the landowner to do something, like build drainage ditches, etc., can also be used.